I will just go ahead and get started by introducing our next speaker. We are very, very honored to be welcoming Dr. Christine Sims today. And the focus of her work is in the areas of Indigenous bilingual education and language revitalization. She obtained her doctoral degree from University of California at Berkeley with a specific focus on Indigenous language revitalization. And she's currently a faculty member of the bilingual program in the Department of Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies in the College of Education and Human Services. And she serves as a faculty member in the Educational Linguistics program at the University of New Mexico. She directs the American Indian Language Policy Research and Teacher Training Center, which she founded in 2008. And they prepare Indigenous language speakers to teach in community and school-based language initiatives, providing technical assistance to tribes in language program planning and related areas of program implementation. And she is an enrolled tribal member of Acoma Pueblo. Please welcome Dr. Christine Sims. We are so grateful that she is here today to share about her work and experiences with all of us. Welcome, Dr. Sims.
Okay. Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. Excuse me. I wanted just to maybe start off with some slides that will give you the context for where I am zooming in from. As Anne mentioned, I am from New Mexico here in the southwest part of the United States. And so if you would just give me a second and let me open up my slide deck, then we can go on from there. Okay, I want to check, can everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So again, for maybe especially international participants who are not familiar with the indigenous languages of the southwestern part of the United States, I live in New Mexico, which is, this state here. I am from one particular tribal group here in New Mexico called Acoma Pueblo. And our people, Puebloan people, and now I'm talking about a larger group here, our Puebloan people have had ties to the Southwest for who knows how many centuries and eons of time. This shows you just very quickly here some of the ancestral homelands of different indigenous peoples in the Southwest, where Pueblo people trace their ancestry back to these lands here in this gray marked area. Today, many of these sites, like what you see here, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Canyon de Chelly over in Arizona, those are places that are now historical sites. And for Pueblo people especially, we trace many of our migration stories to these places, which we have names for. Today, we occupy primarily along the main river running through the northwest part of New Mexico, about the Rio Grande. There are pueblos located along this riverbank, but also to the west. And this shows you a little bit more closely where these pueblos are located. I highlighted in here where my pueblo is located, Acoma. Over to the west of Albuquerque. You see, Albuquerque is one of the major cities of Albuquerque. We don't have too many big cities in New Mexico, but Albuquerque is the main one. So my pueblo over here in the highlighted area is about 60 miles, I would say 60 miles west of Albuquerque. in totality, there are 22 different sovereign nations in the state of New Mexico. These are all indigenous tribes who have their own governance system, their own languages, their own social cultural traditions and practices. In many of the things that we share as pueblos, which you see with the on the marked by the diamonds in this map, have some similarities, but we also have some very distinct differences. And culturally, we also, as Pueblo people, are very different from our neighbors, the Diné people, the Navajo Diné Nation. You see their reservation areas marked here in the large gold areas. And then also distinctly different are the Apache, Jicarilla Apache people who are located up north and also down here, down south. So in totality, every one of these indigenous nations are sovereign, and we make up the 22 sovereign nations of New Mexico. In particular, the land base that my pueblo has always occupied, this was not land that we were assigned to or given to us. This is our homeland where we have always been. And our land base right now is this area south of the main interstate highway that runs east and west across New Mexico. And within this reservation boundary, we have our what we call our home village, and I'll show you a photo very quickly in a few minutes, which is Acoma. The old folks name for this is actually Hagu, and Hagu means to make ready, to be prepared or prepare for, because in our oral traditions, we say that the place of Hagu was a place that was already made ready for us as we migrated from the north. And so these lands, like I said, are lands that we've occupied for centuries. We have two other villages located here, McCarty's and Acomita. These are villages that where our modern amenities are. We have electricity, running water, and a school that is in between these two villages. But back at the old village, what we call Agu or Hagu, we don't have those things by choice. So very unique place in terms of where we live. Here's the old village here. Um, our people all maintain family homes back at the old village. But like I said, this is a place atop 300-foot high mesa top where our village is located. And it is here that we all return back for our ceremonial life. There are some families that live here year round. We all have family homes here. And it's a very busy place when we all come back together to um, live here, come back here. And with COVID, unfortunately, having entered into our land as well, we've been limited in terms of uh, opening the village up, especially to outsiders. Within that line that I showed you, that land area is closed off to outsiders out of out of vigilance for the virus, but inevitably it still came, and it still has hit our community hard um, over the past 2 years. This is another view of the village from the side. From the south, you see a mountain in the far north. That's one of our four sacred mountains. We call that mountain Kaweshtima. Kaweshtima, it refers to a place where there is snow. And right now there is a bit of snow on the top of that mountain. That is one of our four sacred mountains to the north. Much of our homes on top of the village still use traditional materials that we uh, have always used, meaning sandstone. cut from the sandstone rocks that are abundant. That was our building material. That was also the material that was used prehistorically in some of the places that I mentioned as part of our ancestral homeland. Um, they also used for mortar just the mud that was available. And many of our traditional homes still use these materials as well. There are other pueblos, much like ours, in other places like Taos Pueblo. These are places that build their houses in similar ways. And while while Taos Pueblo in far northern New Mexico is a pueblo somewhat like ours, their language is very different. In fact, there's no connection between our languages. So on those 22 nations that I showed you earlier, the languages are really very different as well. So this is the, sorry, so this is the background that I come from in terms of the the people that I come from, but also as well the things that cultural experiences that have made us who we are. I will show you very briefly these slides that will show you how many different languages we have. I'm sorry. Let's see. In New Mexico, among the 22 sovereign nations that we have, these are the major language families. And many of these languages were here at the time that the Spanish first entered into the Southwest. The main families among the Pueblo tribes are Keres, which has 7 different dialects, Towa, which is spoken only by one Pueblo, Jemez, Zuni, which is only spoken in that one Pueblo as well. Tiwa is another language family, was spoken by 4 different Pueblo tribes. Tewa is the other language family spoken by 6 different Pueblo tribes. All of these comprise Pueblo languages and dialects of these languages, and they're all different. Keres people can't understand Towa, Tiwa, or Tewa, and vice versa. Among the dialects of Keres, however, there is some degree of mutual intelligibility, closer among some pueblos than others, but there's still a, a similarity in terms of the language structure itself. And in some cases, vocabulary will be different. They will have different meanings in different pueblos. These Pueblo languages are very different from our Athabascan neighbors that speak their language in uh, commonly known as Navajo, but of course their own name for themselves is Diné. And so the language itself is akin to the language spoken by the Apache people, but still also with some differences in terms of their language. What's unique about all of these languages, regardless of the language family, is the fact that they've existed primarily as oral-based traditions, and probably with the exception of Navajo, which is written, um, and, and that happened actually fairly, I would say, in contemporary times, starting in the late 1890s when that language started to be documented. But primarily, the rest of the other languages have not been put into written form, and they very much are based in oral traditions. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. Um, the last thing I want to mention here is that unlike worldwide languages, most of these have been used primarily for community uses. And so they've not really been taken beyond the bounds of their use within communities. And even today, you will not find many of these languages in written form. You will not find them in being used for formal academic purposes or for modern science, that sort of thing. So again, these languages are also have no base in terms of Indo-European languages, and they are uniquely situated in the Southwest, meaning that they don't have any close ties with other indigenous languages in the United States. Many of our people have carried on these traditions of culture and language, as I mentioned, for centuries. Many of our people have um, undergone some historic periods in our history when language and culture were really the object of uh, policies that were meant to eradicate and destroy these languages. Um, Probably much more so under American federal government, which took over the New Mexican territory in the late 1800s. But regardless of those, and in spite of those oppressive periods of colonization, missionization, and exploration, these cultures, Pueblo cultures and languages, continue to persist. And so today, many of our people still guard these languages in to some uh, degree, even in spite of oppressive policies, especially during the Spanish period of occupation, which was in the 16th century. These languages and the cultural practices continued even though they were continued out of sight of their oppressors. And so the tenacity in which our people have held on to these, I think, speaks a lot about the resiliency of our people in terms of not only safeguarding their culture, but also with that, the language. And so consequently today, for Pueblo people, many of us still continue to hold on to these languages. Although we are now seeing much more threats to the maintenance of these languages, primarily because of just the increased um, um, interactions with a mainstream society in which English is the main dominant language. And so over at least a good century, when the US federal government used education as a tool for eradicating language and for forced assimilation of children, many of these languages did suffer. Uh, and yet, in spite of all of that, there continued to be a core of internal resistance that ensured that even what American school administrators, education policy makers sought to destroy, even in spite of all of that, these languages persisted. So I really have a how would you say, a very deep respect for the generations that continue to hold on to these things, because as Pueblo people today, we would not have those cultures, we would not have these languages if people from the past centuries had not held on to them, had not found ways to keep them alive, even in spite of all the oppression that they endured through three different regimes. If you think about it, starting with the Spanish in the 16th century, And then the Mexican period came in the 1700s. And then lastly, the American federal government came in the 1800s. And of course, that's what we are under now. But in spite of that, the languages have persisted. Now, to bring you up to what we are currently being challenged with is things that we have observed probably starting maybe I would say in the 1970s, especially. And we, many of us who have been able to retrospectively examine how it is that languages, especially our Pueblo languages, got to the point where they are now, um, with language shift happening very rapidly now since I would say the 1970s. Many of us who have been in the field of education have also wondered what influences have been there with regard to earlier things that happened along the way in more contemporary times. For example, when the US federal government, of course, came into the picture in the late 1800s, um, uh, if you know anything about American Indian education, the history of boarding schools, for example, were the main tools in which the government tried to remove children from their families, their communities, and assimilate them. And so the thought was that by taking children away from their environments, that they would soon forget not only their languages but their cultures, and would turn on their own people, so to speak. And there was a period of time in the early 1900s when some of our Pueblo children attended these schools, but not a lot. In fact, most of them attended boarding schools right within New Mexico. There were two, especially, that were established in Albuquerque and one in Santa Fe in the late 1890s into the early 1900s. Those schools primarily were attended by older children, but for younger children, the federal government in the early 1900s began to also establish what they called day schools. These were still government operated schools. They still employed the same policies in terms of forbidding the use of native languages, punishing children for using those languages in school. And I think, especially among Pueblo people, again, I use those words, the tenacity in which they held on to the language was possible even in this period of time of assimilation policies. Because for many Pueblo villages where some of these day schools were situated, uh, the children were actually able to return, after school was over in the afternoons. They would go home, walk home, to their homes and families. And that's where the languages were still very much alive, and families still used them, parents, grandparents, living in multi-family homes. That would have been the support that children needed to be able to maintain those languages in spite of the fact that they were being forced to learn English. So it's those generations of children, and I would probably compare them to the generation of my own parents, who are now gone. But they had attended those day schools, and that was the generation that was probably our first full bilingual generation of people. So they had learned English by way of school, but they also were able to maintain the native language. And I think, if we look now in retrospect, that ability to hold on to those languages and still use them, especially with the children, that's really what enabled our languages to exist for a much longer time than perhaps in other places where indigenous languages were completely lost. Um, in our Pueblos communities, many of our elders, uh, probably the oldest folks in our communities, are now, I would say, in their 90s, late 80s, 90s. And those would have been the generations that experienced that first schooling in day schools, federal government operated day schools. Some of them might have gone on to the boarding schools in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. But the fact that they were still somewhat in proximity to their own villages, I think enabled our languages to continue to last for much longer. Um, but things began to change after the 1960s because there were many things that were happening, of course, nationally, with the social movements for equity and justice, coming about in the 1960s. Many federal programs actually grew from those movements, social movements in the United States. A lot of programs that were targeted for minority communities emerged, like Head Start programs. These were preschool programs for young children. And these were especially targeted for minority communities, including indigenous people. And among the pueblos here in New Mexico, these programs, were introduced and grew in almost every community. And in the 60s, that was probably the first time that the introduction of English really began to happen at a much earlier age than in previous generations, meaning before the age of 5. And so those programs have existed in our communities since the 60s. Some of them are still here, have been in our communities for decades now. But perhaps that was one contribution to later generations that began to use more English than they were the indigenous languages. That's been a thought among many of our own indigenous scholars here um, among our pueblos in New Mexico. But socially, there were other things going on. The introduction of a wage earning economy brought more contact with between our people in American dominant society. Transportation, railroads, a highway coming through our land. You saw that map I showed you earlier where the Acoma land boundaries are, but right north of there is an interstate highway that was built on top of what was the original old, what they call Highway 66, the transnational road that went east and west across the United States. So a lot of those things began to change, even our communities in terms of access to English, access to an English speaking society. Certainly, many of our indigenous men went off to war in the world wars that we had. They were exposed to more English, bringing English back home into the community. Um, there was also the fact that government programs like housing urban development introduced homes that in some ways these were modern day homes that were introduced in communities that were meant to provide housing for individual families. And in some ways that may have broken up kind of the pattern of multiple families living under one household, because now what came to be known as HUD homes were now available for nuclear family units to live in one house, and maybe the grandparents were still in the old home or family home. And so that pattern of children being able to hear language under one roof from multiple generations in essence begin to also split apart. And so the question we've always had is, did that also contribute to the fact that children didn't have that immersion in the language from multiple generations like previous generations had? So many of those things, including then, of course, 70s brought about TVs, radios, the technology of the time brought English into homes. And so many things were also beginning to change internally within our own communities that opened up the doors to hearing more English, and certainly English use among um, parent generations, child generations, school age generations, all of that combined uh, I think led up to the fact that by the 1990s, when we did an internal survey within our own Pueblo community here at Acoma, it was difficult to find children below the age of 5 who were speaking our native language as their first language. The tables that flipped. English was now their first language, and we were lucky if we found any children who actually spoke or could speak these languages as communicative languages. They might have had a passive understanding, but they weren't using them as the first language anymore. So by the 1990s, especially here in New Mexico, among the Pueblos, we were beginning to see these shifts in language happen much more rapidly. And certainly compulsory education by now was in effect. I mean, this went back to the 60s actually, when all children had to attend school. But of course, these were English-based schooling experiences that they were going through, and so again, English usage became more of the normal pattern for school-age children. In New Mexico, by the 1990s, there were a lot of people beginning to get concerned that with the uh, um, with bilingual education, which had opened some programs in some of our schools, but primarily bilingual education as we knew it back in the 70s really no longer existed in the same ways that we had initially encountered these programs. And I say that because um, bilingual education really began to shift the way in the 1980s, just again, because of changes in government administrations and the emphasis on English primarily. And so bilingual programs for many of our communities didn't exist by the 1990s anymore. They were gone. So there was a long gap there in terms of any school kinds of programs that would have supported continued bilingual education development for many children. And so it was that concern that brought many of us together in the mid 1990s to really think about what were other indigenous communities going through at this time. And so we learned from the examples of the Maori people and the Hawaiian people about their efforts to revitalize their languages and what they did to create the environments in which young children would be learning these languages once more. And we learned from those lessons a great deal in such that by 1996, my Pueblo and some other Pueblos in New Mexico um, started the work of language immersion education within our communities. And initially, we did not start with schools. We started within our own communities, utilizing the support of people, fluent speakers in our communities. They weren't necessarily degreed people or people with formal academic backgrounds, but they had the knowledge of the language. They were fluent in the language. And that's how we began our efforts in our Pueblo in around 1997, where we piloted these summer programs, summer immersion programs for our own children. And over time, they grew so much that we began to think, well, we're working with our children in the summer in the community. What happens to them when they return back to school? Well, they go back to an English-based environment. So by 2001, many of us started to approach local schools to ask if we could take our immersion approaches into the local schools where we could provide immersion classes for their children from our communities. And so that began that cycle of trying to establish immersion programs, immersion classes in some of our Pueblo schools. But I will tell you, to be honest, it also opened up a whole different can of worms when we were working with public education, because we were coming into their territory, so to speak, in their own policies with regard to the credentialing of teachers, their policies regarding assessment, their policies regarding curriculums. All of those things began to be the a new set of hurdles that we had to address in many of our experiences over the last 2 decades. It's been about how do Indigenous people exercise their own agency and their sovereignty in terms of dealing with public education institutions, so that the goals of the communities in terms of wanting their children to have access to language learning opportunities is addressed, even as our children attend public schools, 8 hours a day, 180 days out of the year. And those have been some of the bigger challenges, contemporary challenges that we have come across in our efforts to bring language into the schools. Um, and I know that there have been 2 examples in New Mexico where the communities themselves have taken up the work of creating their own schools. In Cochiti Pueblo, which is a Keres speaking Pueblo, we have an example of an Indigenous scholar from that Pueblo who started her own Montessori school, a full immersion, Keres immersion Montessori school. It's the only one of its kind in New Mexico. They've been at it now for at least a good 7-8 years. And I can tell you that the in my work here at the University of New Mexico in our American Indian Language Center here, I've had the privilege of working with that educator and her staff and her teachers uh, to see that program grow and flourish, and to see the children actually um, develop their Keres language communication skills, to a level that they did not have when they first came to that little school. So that's one instance. Another example that I always point to is Jemez Pueblo, which speaks a very different language. They speak Towa. That is a Pueblo that has had decades of a federal funded Head Start program for children, under the age of 5. All the years that they've had an English-based program, and I think they also began to see the evidence of children shifting more towards English over these last decades or so. And this is very unusual for this particular community because that is one Pueblo that has maintained their language generationally, if that's a word, meaning that if you were to go into that village, you would hear not only adults, older adults, middle adults, adolescents, young children, even the age of 5, that you could still hear that language being used, and it wasn't spotty here and there. It was all of the generations using that. But they as a community begin to see these same little red flag warnings, if you will, of the most youngest of their children beginning to bring more English back home. And so over the years, again, I had the opportunity, we had the opportunity to work with them through our language center. And they began to hear some of the stories of other neighboring tribes having these issues with language shift. But they took it upon themselves to learn more about what it would take for them to start early in supporting young children's native language development. And long story short, they made the decision to transition that what was once formerly you could say an English-based Head Start program into a full TOA immersion program. So that today, if you go into that program, Head Start program, you will hear young children, 3 to 5, speaking in that language, and English is left outside the door. Um, but they did it because they realized they were the only Pueblo that speaks that language. And if they didn't do anything about it, it might be too late. So those are promising examples that I always try to remind people, as difficult as it may seem, as challenging as it may seem, it's possible, it's doable when you have a community of people who are willing to work together, to be supportive of one another, and who are willing to start things on their own if they have to, not waiting for formal school systems to start a language initiative. Because as we know, schools can only have a limited influence, but it's the communities, it's themselves that have to take up that ownership and responsibility for addressing these challenges that we are now faced with, um, not only in New Mexico, but across the United States with our indigenous languages. So I'm going to just end my talk there because I'm conscious of the time here in case anybody wants to chime in or comment or has a particular question. But that in a nutshell has been our experience in New Mexico with languages. Like I said, I've been privileged to work with many of our Pueblo tribes in New Mexico, mainly through the work that I do here at the university, through the American Indian Language Center. And I hope that we can continue that support um, to our indigenous communities. But moreover, I hope that in the long term, we really do see a reverse in that language shift happening as more communities step forward and address these with initiatives that really are going to make a change in terms of children's language development. And are you still with us?
I am.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sims, for that wonderful talk. That was some amazing learning. I see we do have a question, so we'll hop right
Okay.
in. And if anyone
Okay.
else has questions or would like to share any of your own experiences with Dr. Sims, please just type it in the chat. So we have a question from Lorna Williams. She asks, what is the state of your languages today?
So um, I would say in my own community, and I can't really speak for all of the other communities, but I would say that probably the status of language vitality in our community is such that the fluency level is probably in the generations, I would say people who are 60 and older. It begins to get a little less so in adult ranges that are younger than 50 maybe perhaps. And we are now at the stage where school age children are having to learn these languages as second languages. With the other Pueblo communities in New Mexico, the same situation varies. There are some communities like what I just pointed out to you with Jemez Pueblo, in which the vitality is much more stronger there because you have multiple generations still using those languages and speaking them. We have other communities like that. Um, if you can imagine an imaginary kind of spectrum, on one hand, we have those communities that still have a pretty good, strong language base. But at the other extreme end, we do have some of our Pueblo communities that are down to maybe just 50 speakers, and they're all older, and the Pueblo populations themselves are maybe no larger than 1,000 maybe tribal members. So that's when, well, all of these situations create very fragile situations for all of them, but especially so for those communities that don't have that many people to begin with, and then not that many speakers left either.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Jasmine Johnson. She wants to know what the top strategies or programs for success in your communities are.
Top strategies. Well, I would have to say that probably the more effective ways in which we have helped our communities understand is that um, those immersion approaches that where we have learned quite a bit from the Maori and the Hawaiian examples in other places as well. I know that um, there are other native nations in Canada, in the northeast coast area. The Aguasasni peoples have long used immersion in as part of their schools. Um, those kinds of approaches are probably the best way to provide a good support for language learning. But I do know that many communities struggle with that simply because some communities may be at the point where they don't have enough fluent speakers. So I know in the case of Cherokee, where I've been doing some work with them, um, they've used the master apprentice approach that we've seen in many, used by many California languages, where they have uh, had adults learning these languages, second languages, and then they in turn are the adults that go back and populate the immersion school that they have, and immersion programs that they have in their schools. And some communities are having to do that because they don't have enough first language speakers of these indigenous languages. um, eh, I don't think there's one particular kind of program that we could say works, plop it in every every community and somehow we all come out with speakers. It doesn't work that way. What I do think though is when communities understand what it's going to take to turn that situation around, where they provide a good environment for hearing that language and then given opportunities for learners to use that language, that's probably one of the best ways to help people learn that language. And certainly with young children, a lot of experiential kinds of experience while you're using language is the best way that children learn. um, they learn that way, for anything that they want to do. And we keep reminding fluent speakers, don't think that language teaching for a young 5-year child is teaching them flashcards. Children want to do things, and when you're talking with them while they're doing things, that's how they absorb the language. And so if you want to ask me about effective strategies, well, that's one of the things that I think is most helpful, especially for young language learners. And I will say as adults too.
Thank you, Dr. Sims. That's wonderful learning. We have another question from Amanda, actually. She says, can you talk about the intergenerational relationships that are so needed for the younger generation with elders and how your community is going out about that work? And what are some of the issues in bringing elders and younger generations together again? Are young people interested in working with elders, and are they asking for this contact?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of our young people, especially school age people, do yearn for that link. They might not say it outrightly, but I will say that in my community, for example, we did a survey one time among high school uh, students, and we asked them, why are you even taking this language immersion class that we're doing, in the high school? And some of the responses that the students gave were really eye openers. One I remember specifically, one boy said, I want to learn the language because I want to be able to talk to my grandma. I was not able to talk to her before she passed away. And he really felt that the way to link back to those generations was to be able to use the language. And so in a way you could kind of hear the regret in his voice that he didn't have the means to communicate with his grandma the way he would have wanted to. um, I think that idea of that intergenerational linkage for not just cultural learning but language learning is critical, because for a couple of reasons. One, um, it not only adds to that social support that we as indigenous people really feel is an important aspect of our communities, where young children learn the values of being in relationship to older people, elders, grandparents. There are values associated with that in many of our indigenous communities in terms of how you respect and you honor. And so certainly your speech and language that you use with them is evidence of that respect. So um, I think there's a lot of yearning of how do I use language with them. But as well, I think that many of our own elders, I know, um, probably would like to do more, but they have not quite found a way, or maybe people have not approached them in a way that would create a place for them if we have programs and things like that. And I think that's a really critical element we have to think of. I know that when we started some of our immersion summer programs, we had elders who stepped to the plate, who were willing to help us, and some of us who were middle-aged adults, said we really need the support of elders, because in an immersion setting, which kind of was new for us, because we knew the language, but to stay in that language without reverting to English was something that even challenged us. But we said we need fluent speakers to help us. And so um, there was one lady in particular. She had to already have been in her 80s at that time. This was in the 1990s. She said to us in the language, she said, I want to help you ladies. She said, I want to help you ladies with this language teacher. She said, but she said, I'm not young enough anymore to be sitting on the floor, or because we were dealing with young children. She said, but I will be here if you need me, she said. And so we found a way for grandma to be in the classroom, and she was there, and she was a model for showing the children how to address grandma, because grandma couldn't hear good anymore, and then there were instances where we got stuck with how do we say peanut butter because we didn't have a word for peanut butter. And so grandma right on the spot helped us figure out how to describe that food, because we had it as a snack, for the children. So I guess what I'm saying is that when we find ways to include them, they are our best resources, but they may not be comfortable. And a lot of them often say, well, I'm not a teacher, and because they think of teaching as something formal. But if we approach them in a way that makes them feel welcome, that makes them feel that they can contribute their knowledge, and also create those linkages with the children in some way, our learners, that's really how I think we can make sure that we strengthen that bond. Um, are kids interested in wanting to learn? I was surprised when high school kids really were asking to learn. And as we found out in our particular circumstances, one of the other key reasons why they wanted to learn language was because they realized that language was what opens the door to a lot of activities and things that they see the members of their community participate in. But without the language, then that can close some doors, because they won't be fully understanding what's being said and all of that. So um, it surprised me that in our experience, older high school boys who were bigger than us, and they were the athletes and the jocks, they were the ones that kept coming back to the classes, and they were the ones who kept wanting to learn. And I think generally I see this in a lot of communities, but I also recognize that sometimes the influences of mainstream schooling, whatever, begin to shift that idea about the prestige of language. And I know that many things, other scholars have written about this, where children feel ashamed, to use that language because they equate it with, not being, as good as their friends who speak English or whatever. So there's that prestige factor that also critical, especially in the development of youth identity, that we have to pay attention to. And so when we valorize our languages, when we support our language learners and kind of give them that attaboy, you're trying, you'll get it. That those are the positive feedback we need to be given our learners to make them want to continue learning.
Thank you. So I think we have one comment and maybe one more question. Are you up for one more?
Sure.
All right. So Priscilla Jula just says that was a wonderful collaboration indeed. Thank you, Dr. Christine. So just some words of appreciation for you there.
Thank
And
you.
then Kevin also wants to know, Dr. Sims, what are you involved with now?
A lot of things. So let's see, what am I involved with now? I am still working through our language center on advocacy issues. There are a lot of things like I mentioned that come into play, especially when we're talking about issues where the issues of language and public education intersect. So a lot of advocacy work is often part of what I do at the state level, whether it's advocating in legislative, bills, whether it's, updating and informing legislators, policymakers about issues of native language maintenance and revitalization. Many of these people are unaware of how critical these issues are for our communities, and I remind them that these are not languages like we see global languages. These, for us as indigenous people, these are existential issues, because without language, cultures don't survive. And so I do a lot of that work. I do a lot of on-site training work with communities, fluent speakers who want to start teaching the language, or they want to start planning maybe some activities or programs in their community. I do that on site with the fluent speakers. I also teach my own classes here at the university to try to make our own students aware of these issues of language. Many of my classes are graduate level classes. They are in the bilingual education program. But many of these university students are going to be our next wave of teachers going out in the field. And I tell them, if you're teaching here in New Mexico, I hope you know about some of the indigenous languages that our kids speak. And so a lot of that basic 101 I'm doing here at the university, even in my coursework with students.
Wonderful, thank you. And Kevin says you are a busy woman, someone to admire. Thank you. Yes, agreed. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sims. I think if anyone else has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Right.
But I just have one.
Okay.
Do you have any words of advice or encouragement for folks in other parts of the world who may be thinking about getting started in the language revitalization process?
Yeah, I would just say, take those first baby steps, whatever it is that you are committed to. Don't try to do everything all at once, because sometimes the work can be overwhelming when you think about, how am I going to turn this thing around? But you start with what you can. You work with those folks that are on the same wavelength as you are, and you grow that, because everybody's not going to jump on the same bandwagon. I mean, I know that from experience. But you start with the people that believe in the same thing, that are willing to commit, because this is not a program we're talking really about a lifetime commitment. Because for all the centuries it took um, to create these situations of language erosion, it's going to take that time and probably double in the lifetime to make sure these languages continue to exist. So don't be come what's the word, discouraged, um, and do what you can on your part. I keep saying I'm not going to be here forever, but I hope somebody else is ready to take that baton, and keep going with it. So those are little things that I can think of to say now. But I do want to thank you for listening in, and I hope that our paths meet again. And Anne, you and Amanda have been doing great work with pulling this together. I'm just really in awe of your ability and skills to do this, and I want to thank you for bringing us all together. This has been a great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sims. We enjoyed so much getting to listen to you. It was really a pleasure. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in this evening. I think we all learned a lot and have a lot to think about after this wonderful talk. And I would like to remind everybody that we will be starting off tomorrow with a talk from Pius Akumbu, who's also going to be touching on education and language in schools. He'll be talking a little bit about his own work to start a mother tongue immersion school in Babanki, in his home village in Cameroon. So I hope you all can join us. And let's get a virtual round of applause again for Dr. Sims. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening or morning, wherever you are.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.